Good morning, everybody. So glad to be back after our 3-week hiatus. We were gone to, Carrie and I were gone polishing the pulpit, and then I was gone the last 2 weeks of work out of town. So glad to be back, and so we'll keep plugging along on our class. So continuing our study on church history and just following the progression of Christianity as the world would see it, define it, from the New Testament, from Acts chapter 2 when the church was established, to what we see today, and just kind of looking at the broad landscape of religion in general to try to see how we went from one church here, the Lord's church, that we start having these divergences till we get the vast landscape, and we'll keep adding to this as we go. But, and we've seen this over and over again, small changes, a lot of things. You look at some of the passages we keep up there, Judges 17:6 and 21:25, every man doing what is right in their own eyes. There was no king in Israel, so every man did what was right in their own eyes. Hosea 4:6, you look at Israel was rebuked because they didn't have any knowledge. They were rebuked for their lack of knowledge. And then you look at 2 Timothy 4:3-4, that Paul's exhortation to the young evangelists that, to preach the word, be instant in season, out of season, because there's going to come a time people are not going to want to hear what you have to say. They're going to have their itching ears, and they're going to go somewhere where someone's going to tell them what they want to hear. And that's basically a quick synopsis of how we have the world today, where we went from one church in Acts chapter 2 to one on every corner that all believes something different and everyone thinks they're right. And so the goal of this has been to look at what they teach, how they got to that point, what they teach, and look at what the Word of God says. Is that in accordance with what the Word of God says? And oftentimes, when we look at some of these denominations, we see clearly it's not. We've looked in our last few lessons, we spent some time on the Church of England, and we saw several things that were very different from what the Word of God teaches. Just think of its leadership structure. It's basically the English version of Catholicism, where it has basically the same structure, but in addition to the Archbishop of Canterbury being the head of the church, there's 3 steps above that. You have Parliament, the Prime Minister, who until recently, maybe he still is, but getting ready to not be, wasn't even a Christian, he was Hindu, and then the Monarch of England. So we don't see that in the Word of God, that any monarch takes a place in leading the church, other than just setting the standard. We saw Israel do that. They set the standard, we're going to follow God, but they were not the leader. Still had the role of the priesthood and the high priest in that time even. So we saw things like that. We spent some time going over a couple other religions, Presbyterianism in our last class, and then we also spent some time going over Quakerism and talking about some of the things with that, some of their beliefs and their false beliefs, such as the belief in not partaking the Lord's Supper or refusing baptism. Dealt with things like instrumental music, why we don't use it in the Lord's church. So we've been looking at some of their beliefs and hitting some of the high points on them and some of the basics. And 2 of them that we noticeably skipped over were Methodism and Baptist church. And they should have been in the outline in that last lesson, but I skipped over them because in our coming up lessons, we'll go into a much deeper study on Methodism and Baptist church. Lord willing, next week we'll start on Methodism and what it is and some of the different sects of it. And as we see with those, there's a lot of different Methodist church, a lot of different versions of it. There's a lot of different versions of the Baptist church. And while they believe in a lot of the same major things, their foundation is different from one another, and they do have some nuances in their beliefs, differences in their beliefs. For example, most Baptist churches are instrumental music, whereas the Primitive Baptist Church doesn't believe in instrumental music. They say it needs to be a cappella music. And for a lot of the same reasons, the Lord's church would say we can't have instruments. So there are some nuanced differences between some of them. But this arrives us, we've been going all the way through this time. It's been a lot of time leading up to the Reformation in Europe and how that was really spurred on to start forming these different denominations, the major ones being Lutheranism, Calvinistic formed type ones, and Anglicanism. But we also start seeing these other ones. What we're going to see now is we're to that point in history to where the New World is discovered, and it really starts becoming a bigger issue. And what we will see this, especially with Roman Catholicism, is they were very big in partially believing in Matthew 28, 18, 19, especially 19. Go ye therefore, teach all nations, and baptize them in the name of the Father, name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost. They were very evangelistic. In some states they still are, not necessarily in the United States, but in some places they still are. And whenever they came to the New World, they brought their religion with them, and they began evangelizing, and their method of evangelizing, which is not necessarily what biblical evangelism should be always. Many times they took on the idea, what you see in Muslim world, whenever they would conquer a land, that you're either going to be Muslim or we will execute you. And you start seeing that some too with Roman Catholicism when they came into the New World. And so, not quite what Christ had envisioned when he told us to go and teach the world. Whenever we look at different denominations, they all have different personalities. Even amongst different denominations, sects of different denominations, they have different personalities. We even see this in the Lord's church, where depending on where it is located geographically, it develops a personality of that congregation that, while maybe it's not a scriptural issue, they just have a different personality. It's just the culture of the area. When Carrie and I lived in Vernal, Utah, the congregation there had a very different personality from the congregation we went to in Columbia, South Carolina. When we moved here, this congregation had its own personality too that was different from that in Utah or South Carolina. It's not that one was right and one was wrong. Scriptural congregations are scriptural congregations, but culture around the area tends to make different personalities. So we start seeing this in the religious world. But when we talk about denominationalism, these personalities rely heavily upon the circumstances that surround them. And we see that too. Throughout history, these denominations, as well as their different ideologies and theological concepts, these are very important in forming these types of personalities in them. When we study American Christianity, and again, we'll use that term very loosely, not the biblical sense of Christianity, worldly sense of Christianity, but when we contrast American Christianity versus European Christianity, we looked at that. We see there's a very distinctive personality between the two of them, and it probably is just in large due to the difference in cultures between the East and the West. As new explorers began to discover and develop the New World, the spirit of liberty and pioneering brought new developments in the history of Christianity. Once it came to the New World, denominationalism began to segregate rapidly. You start seeing a lot of divisions in denominationalism that forms kind of like the basis. We'll pick on the Baptist Church. When it first came to America, of course, it had only started about 100 years prior, and it was less than 100 years old at that time. There was one Baptist church. You think of it now, just drive around town here. How many different types of Baptist church are there? You have some that are Southern Baptist, you have Free Will, you have Independent, you have Primitive. I'm drawing a blank now. There's a lot of different ones just driving around town. And so they started segregating segmenting very rapidly, actually. And when we think about it, this idea of returning to the ancient order of things, the Restoration period that started in early 19th century, late 18th century, it also had its birth in the New World. You know, people were freer to look at the Word of God than they had been maybe in the Old World, and the time was right, and people started looking at it like, hey, what we've been teaching and what we've been taught, the Bible doesn't teach that. The notable issue was on infant baptism. You had individuals at that time, you know, Alexander Campbell was one, Barton Stone another, men like that, who separately started studying the Bible and really looking at what they were being taught, and like, this doesn't add up. We're doing something the Bible says not to do. So we're going to start looking our attention more to this American denominationalism, and this class actually will probably be a little bit shorter than some of them, but I didn't want to start in the next one because we can't really get very far into it in class today. So this really goes back to Columbus in 1492. Yes, people had been coming, knew about the New World, the Americas prior to this. There had been Europeans that had come here prior to this, but it was really, this started with Columbus. Even though he, as far as I'm aware, he never stepped foot in what would be the United States, or maybe even the North American or South American continent. He only went to the islands, but it had a profound effect because he discovered this area, which he thought was somewhere else, but other people came back. And when they got there, they found that they had no religion, no Christianity, so that really spurred, especially Roman Catholicism, to start going back. So Quabbin lists two very significant results that we'll look at. First, there was the extension of man's geographical knowledge, and next there was significant discovery and settlement of the New World for mankind in general, and for the Christian church in particular. It was the second of these which we're really going to be focused on, the religious aspect. If we remember what we've studied so far, most of the major, quote, Christian denominations are European. You know, you have of course, Roman Catholic Church, European. The Reformed churches, the Calvinistic churches, they had their roots in Europe, you know, Switzerland with John Calvin. The Church of England, obviously, and then all its offshoots come out of that: Methodist, Episcopal, Quakerism, Lutheran, Germany, Orthodox Church, Eastern Europe. So all of these major denominations have their roots in Europe. However, whenever we look at the ones that came to the United States, they certainly took on an American flavor. A notable example would be the Episcopal Church, which the Episcopal Church is the American version of the Church of England. And if we go back to, we'll talk about this more in a minute, but we go back to who is the head of the Church of England? The monarch of England. So you have a war fought to say we're not going to submit to the monarch of England, but now our religion says we still have to do it. So we're going to make a new religion that's exactly the same, it just has different leadership. So it's an American version. So a lot of these have an American flavor. So Walker states American Christianity is primarily an importation of the old world, and that's very true. So we're going to look at some American adaptions of these denominations. And then when we get to our next lesson, Lord willing, we'll start taking a very deeper dive into some of these. So let's start off with Catholicism, Roman Catholicism. Roman Catholicism was very powerful in Europe. In fact, as we've talked about in this course before, prior to the Reformation, the Roman Catholic Church was basically the government of Europe, with the Pope being the de facto ruler, monarch of Europe, just because it was so powerful. But it's also helpful to see how Roman Catholicism influenced the American religion. It's very difficult to have a complete outline of American Catholicism. You can read books on this and do studies that are pretty detailed, but to have an actual complete one, it's very difficult because so much of it was out on the frontier in areas that, are lost to history. We don't know this. But the first Catholic immigrations, these created Spanish settlements. These were dotted with Catholic missions. Basically, anywhere that the Spanish went, their priests would go with them, and they would set up a Catholic mission. You can still see those throughout the Americas. If you go down to San Antonio, of course you have the Alamo, the most famous of them. But if you go a little bit south of San Antonio, there's several Catholic missions, very large ones that are still there. They're national park sites now, but they're very interesting to go to and visit some of those. They're pretty old. Trying to remember if they're 17th century maybe. So they're pretty old. But when the Catholics would go, Spanish would go somewhere, they were Catholic, and they would set up missions wherever they went. What's interesting was that after Columbus came to the New World and returned, he had been financed by the Spanish. And the Portuguese rejected Columbus' attempts to be able to fund it, and so he went to the Spanish. And as a result, there was some fighting because the Portuguese claimed all these lands, but the Spanish was saying, no, they're ours. We have them. And so the Spanish appealed to the Pope, and they were Catholics, so we're going to go to the Pope, and the Pope's going to settle this for us. So the Pope drew a line of demarcation from the North Pole to the South Pole through the Atlantic, and it claimed all the, quote, heathen lands east of that line were Portuguese. Anything west of that line would belong to the Spanish. And so hopefully you can see this map. You see the furthest east one, the line of demarcation, that was the initial one. It was about 100 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands, and a couple of years later, it was redrawn to be about 300 and some leagues further west. And so what you notice here is it starts cutting into South America. And this is why we have part of the world we have today. If you don't know this, Brazil speaks Portuguese. Everywhere else in South America and in the south of the United States is Spanish. And this is why, because the Portuguese got Brazil and the Spanish got everything else. So, and while they didn't adhere to that, the Portuguese really put their influence on Brazil, and so that's why it's still spoken Portuguese today. But this is what the Pope said was going to be. Spanish got the big prize because they were Catholic, and they were the good Catholics, and I guess the Portuguese were not so. But all the lands east of that would have included heathen lands of Africa and Asia and those sort of things too. So it's not like Portugal missed out on a lot. They had opportunities, and then they owned a bunch of land in Africa too. They had colonized at some point. So on this line, though, the line of demarcation, the Spanish were prohibited from going into Portuguese territory and trading and sailing. Likewise, Portuguese were prohibited from going into Spanish, but no one paid attention. The Spanish still went into Portuguese area. They claimed the Philippines, which would have been rightfully by this law Portuguese, and the Portuguese did the same thing. Every Spanish expedition, invasion, in colonization, they brought their priests with them and missionaries, and they set up missions. So you start seeing this basically forced conversion to Roman Catholicism as the Spanish marched through. When you look at Central and South America, the Spanish missions were established in the West Indies and Mexico. From Mexico, the missionaries found their way into South America, and the Spanish went through conquering everybody in Peru, Chile, Argentina, and then later Brazil by the Portuguese. So that within a short amount of time, less than 100 years, the whole of the South American and Central American continent were Roman Catholic. When you move up into North America, you see something very similar. Ponce de Leon founded St. Augustine, the oldest city in America, in 1565 when he was exploring Florida. Then Spanish missions were established throughout New Mexico and California. I don't think this is California as we would see it on our modern map. This is probably California, Mexican California, which was a lot of the West. Everything basically west of the Rockies that the French and British didn't own. British owned what would be Washington and Oregon, and then the French owned up to the Rocky Mountains. And so probably, I would guess that's what, so I don't know. Not 100% whether that's referencing the state of California or Mexican California.
It's probably Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico.
That'd be my guess. So, but at the same time, the Spanish Catholics were taking so much territory. The French Catholics were doing the same thing in the United States, in North America. They came in early 17th century into Quebec and started founding things. They made claims in North America, Canada, Louisiana, not the state. Think Louisiana Purchase. Half of New York, half of Maine, half Vermont. So at this time, it really looked like the majority of the Americas was going to be Roman Catholic. So we have this map here, and you can kind of see this. I had to adapt it because so much of the stuff was written in French. So, but this shows the territories that were at some point controlled by the French, the blue area on this map, between 1534 and the Louisiana Purchase, early 19th century. And so we'd be French today here, so in Arkansas. But you still see in Florida, South Texas, parts of New Mexico, the Four Corners areas, controlled by Spain, and then Britain, the colonies. So the French, though, they had a lot of forts, a lot of cities through there. So this map shows 60. It says there was 150, though, at this time. But the growth of Roman Catholicism in the United States has been phenomenal. It's still the largest religion in the United States. Beginning in 1673, there was less than about 25,000 Catholics in the United States. And these are United States, not North America or South America. These are United States. It had increased a little bit post-Revolutionary War to around 40,000, about a little less than 1% of the population. 40 years later, it had increased to about 2.5% of the population. Then, in the next 100 years or so, you see a massive increase with massive amounts of immigration coming to the United States of European Catholics. 1860, about 10% of the population was Roman Catholic. 30 years later, it had tripled in size, basically. And then by the 20s, it doubled again almost. Today, or not today, not 2009 is the last numbers I had. I didn't look for more recent ones. I could have, but I didn't. But about 67 million Catholics in the United States in 2009. Now, keep these numbers in mind. These are not devout, showing up every Sunday or for every service like we would here. These aren't the preacher's counts. We can look in the directory and we got 500 members here. That's not how many people actually show up. And Catholicism is a lot like religions like Islam, like Mormon, that if you're born into a Catholic family, you're Catholic because you're baptized at whatever days old. I don't know if it's the 8th day or how early they baptized. I have to ask my friend that, maybe he knows. But they baptize as babies, so they're all Catholics, whether you ever darken the doorway again. And it's like that in our religion. You're born in an Islamic country, you're Islamic. Doesn't matter whether you're not, but so same view on that. But 67 million identify as that. So there's two primary issues which the growth of the Roman Catholic Church can be attributed in the United States. Anybody want to guess what those are?
They don't believe in birth control.
That's one of them. High birth rates.
They never die.
They die eventually. So, no. The other one's the large immigration rates from European Catholics. That brought a large influx into the United States of Roman Catholics, and they settled in places like Boston, where you have a large Catholic population, in Massachusetts, in that area, in those eastern areas. That's why the Northeast is still so heavily Roman Catholic, because that's where most of them went to. And it makes sense. People congregate to what they're familiar with, and if you're Irish and you're coming to the United States, you're going to congregate around a lot of Irish people. If you're German and you come to the United States, you're going to find places where there's other Germans. They can not only speak your native language, they share your culture, and that's part of what the United States has with that. And you get these. It's not quite the same today as it was maybe even when I was born, 45 years ago, but it's still like that to an extent. I mean, why is there such a heavy Cuban population in Florida, and especially South Florida? Because that's where they all went to. Not just because it was the closest, but that's where all the rest of them are at, so I want to go be with them. And then, as was said, the high birth rate. The Catholics do not believe in birth control. They teach it's a sin. And so, traditional Catholic families have a lot of children in them. And so this resulted, even if you only convert 67% of your children to your religion, to your faith, well, if you only have 3 kids, that's two that you're bringing in. If you have 25 kids, it's a lot more.
They do.
Yeah, and a lot of them do. Well, there was a friend of mine I was in the Army with, and he was a few years older than me, but we were the only 2 single guys in the church there, and so we spent a lot of time together, and he came from a large family. He had 11 siblings, and they were members of the church. And I was your family Catholics? Like, no, my parents just didn't believe in birth control. It's like, oh, okay. And so it was people like that in the church too, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I've heard individuals in this congregation that they have several kids that are elderly, and they just said, like, we figured as long as God was going to keep blessing with children, we keep having them. So that's fine. That's not a bad thing. But this was part of the reason why there was such a dramatic growth in Roman Catholicism. And there was also a large conversion rate. Between 1813 and 1893, there was about 700,000 people in the United States converted to Roman Catholicism. So, prior to the Revolutionary War, you kind of look at the religious landscape in the colonies. You have these. Hope you can see these dots. I'm trying to highlight them some so that it's kind of the yellow dots. That's where the focus of Roman Catholicism was in the colonies pre-Revolutionary War. Northern Virginia, Maryland, southern Pennsylvania, southern New Jersey, those areas. And we'll look more at this map here in a few minutes, and they'll kind of talk about why religions were congregated in certain areas. So, American Protestantism, it found its greatest freedom in the American continent. The very beginning, some religions who were in the majority, they attempted to exclude others of differing groups from freedom of religious opportunity. So if we remember, a lot of groups left Europe, came to the United States because of religious persecution. They weren't allowed to freely practice their religion without persecution. So what did they do? They came to the United States where they had this freedom and immediately made laws to prohibit you from having a different religion. We saw this particularly in New England and Massachusetts with the Quakers. The Congregationalists, the Puritans, were the state religion there, and so they persecuted the Quakers because they taught something different. So the ones who fled religious persecution immediately started inflicting religious persecution. So just kind of one of those ironies of history. But the religious climate in America was very healthy. Qualbin says the beginning of Protestantism and the beginning of American colonization were contemporaries. They went hand in hand with one another. America made it easier for additional denominations to begin. Most of the oldest American denominations are just American adaptations from European denominationalism. So let's look at some of these. Walter Raleigh established Virginia in honor of the Virgin Queen Elizabeth. In 1607, he established Jamestown. Church of England was then the state religion, and it's remained established until 1766, which was, nope, we're not listening to y'all anymore. We're doing our own thing. And part of the rebellion against this was the tax demands upon it. When the colonies gained their independence, the Church of England ceased to exist in America. Now, I say this at the time, you can probably still find Church of England's in America, Anglican churches in America. But in its stead, the Protestant Episcopal Church was established in 1789. Again, who was the monarch? Who was the leader of the Church of England? Parliament, the Prime Minister, the monarch of England. We had just fought a war saying, we're not going to submit to you, so we got to change our religion so that we don't have to submit to you anymore. And so basically that's what they did. The body, talking about the Protestant Episcopal Church, perpetuated the faith, liturgy, and spiritual traditions of the Church of England, the mother church, but its organization was carefully adjusted to American needs. So we keep everything the same, except this little part up here at the top, we're going to have different leadership. And that's basically what it is. That's why I say it's the American version of the Church of England. So Congregationalism, which was Reformed theology, this started really gaining traction in England in 1609. The three basic principles called for national church status. They wanted a national church. Freedom of external authority. They didn't want the Pope having any influence on them, or even the monarch of England. And it wanted to create its own organization. It did so. So the Pilgrims were Congregationalists. They set up colonies in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, and Congregationalism was established by law. Interestingly enough, they started founding religious schools. Harvard and Yale, they were founded as religious schools. If I remember correctly, they were created specifically to have a seminary to teach there. So if you think of what they look like today and the things they teach today, it's a far cry from their religious foundation. But what you'll notice is a significant number of elite universities in the United States are religious in character, whether they're complete atheistic now, agnostic, whatever, but borderline atheistic now, but they have religious, Duke University, I believe, is Methodist of some type. And so you have a lot of elite universities that were actually founded to be religious schools. And Harvard and Yale are two examples of that. We then had the Lutherans, which migrated from Holland, early 17th century. They settled in the New York area. They had continual growth. In 2007, they were about 4.5% of the U.S. population, so pretty good size. They're separated into a lot of different groups now, but there has been efforts to make a union between them. The Baptist Church, this was established in America in 1639 in Rhode Island. The growth has been extraordinarily rapid of the Baptist Church. It is the largest Protestant religion in the United States. In 2007, about 38 million. And in 2015, it was about 17% of the U.S. population. The next closest would be the Methodist Church, which is about half that size. As we know, there are significant divisions among the Baptist Church. Most of these started based off the issue of slavery, whether pro-slavery or anti-slavery. And so you have a lot of prominent, I don't know if you would call them conventions or sects of the Baptist Church, which they divided initially because of the issue of segregation and slavery. And then there's been a lot of splinter groups in there. So the Baptist churches, as we know from where we live at, is a very strong religion in the southeastern United States. In fact, they're about 25 to 50% of the population in the southeast. And then a lot of them are fundamentalist or conservative in their theology. So we go back to our 1750 map, and you have Baptists in the south a little bit, but they're really going to be concentrated into eastern Pennsylvania, and especially as it was founded in Rhode Island, in that area. They were really concentrated in these areas pre-Revolutionary War. And then also from this map, the yellow on there, that's the Church of England. That's what they claimed as being their territory, basically. Presbyterian Churches of America, they were settled in Virginia in 1611. Because of persecution, they fled to America with the Puritans. There was an attempt to establish episcopacy in Scotland in 1662, and so this caused many of them to leave Scotland and go to Ireland. And because of some economic difficulties there at the time, they then fled to America. There were about 3,000 to 6,000 Scotch-Irish coming to the colonies each year by about early 18th century. They settled mostly in New England, but then began to spread out south into the middle colonies. But the congregations of Presbyterian were in the United States long before this immigration. There was one worshiping in Virginia as early as 1611, but then you have them in Massachusetts and Connecticut a few years later, and in New York a few years after that. These have divided into at least 4 major groups, but there has been a merger again between some of them, and their growth has been rapid too. In 2007, they were about 6.1 million in the United States, so about 2.7% of the U.S. population. The United Presbyterian Church in the USA, that is the actual title of it, is probably the largest group of Presbyterians. This is a result of a merger in 1958 of 2 large Presbyterian groups. And then when you look at the Presbyterian, the green that you can see, it's hard to see on here, but I can't see this. It's right about in this area. Can't see on the map. That's where mostly the Presbyterians at. But you have this Reformed teaching, which Presbyterians were part of, throughout everywhere. Now again, there's some in the south, some in the mid colonies, but then it really starts getting concentrated, and you get into the New Jersey, New York area. And so this Reformed theology, which Presbyterians would be a part of, were really pervasive in this New York, New Jersey, eastern Pennsylvania area. Quakers are friends. They came to the United States in 1656. They settled first in Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York, and they were persecuted. You know, we've studied at length whenever we're talking about Quakers some of the persecution that they went through, particularly in Massachusetts. Again, ironically, by the same people who fled to Europe because they were being persecuted themselves. But in 1681, William Penn established a haven for them. He had become a Quaker a few years earlier, and his father was owed a lot of money by the British Crown. And he came up with the idea, how about instead of giving me all this money, which was a substantial amount, you give me this land instead. And that didn't go over too well with some of the aristocracy and the nobility, but he had a lot of powerful allies, and they convinced the king, do this, just give him this land. And so he was granted what would we call Pennsylvania, but not Pennsylvania necessarily as we see the map, because at the time Delaware was part of Pennsylvania. And not only that, part of modern New Jersey would have been part of Pennsylvania too. So that was a pretty good prize. You know, that's a lot of, Pennsylvania's a big state. You know, you don't really realize how big it is till you have to drive across it, and it's a big state. So in 2003, the Quakers were about 110,000 in the United States, but their numbers have dramatically decreased. To 2017, 14 years later, they'd lost about 30,000 people in the United States alone. And their worldwide membership's about 377,000, the bulk of them in Africa. The Methodist Church, this is the second largest Protestant denomination in the United States. In 2007, they had about 15 million members. They came to America not as Methodists, Charles and John Wesley were Anglicans. They were members of the Church of England. They were not trying to start a new religion. They wanted to, we'll get into this more in our next lesson, Lord willing, but they wanted to do certain things to improve it, basically. And, they had a methodology, hence the name Methodists. But they were promoting the Church of England, though. But some of the leading figures in American Methodism, Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury, after Revolutionary War, 1784, they no longer wanted to be part of the Church of England because that was not good since we just fought a war to rid ourselves of them. So, in a conference in Baltimore, they adopted the name Methodist Episcopal, and they started assembling under that name at that point. So I don't know how well you can see this map. I can always email this to you if you want. I found this on National Geographic, and it's kind of a breakdown of the colonies and their kind of religious aspect. So the yellow down the bottom, Virginia, Carolinas, Georgia, these were Church of England. These were heavily Church of England. And then, of course, Pennsylvania, Quakerism. Maryland was Roman Catholic. It was very much dominated by the Roman Catholic Church. And then, of course, New York, as we talked about, heavily in the Reformed Church, Calvinistic, and so they were dominated by that. New Hampshire were just separatist groups. Massachusetts and Maine, which was part of Massachusetts, they were Puritan. They were Congregationalists. Really dominated that. Then Connecticut, you had the Congregationalists, and Rhode Island Baptists were dominant. New Jersey was kind of a mix. It's in that area that's kind of surrounded by all kinds of them. So they were a mix of Quakers, Roman Catholics, and Lutheran. Delaware was dominantly Lutheran. So it's kind of an idea of kind of the breakdown of the religious groups in America. And again, when people immigrate, they go and find like-minded people with similar beliefs, similar theology, similar cultures, and that's kind of how they combine together. So this is just a very brief survey that's going to lead into our more detailed study, Lord willing, next week, but it shows how a lot of the Protestant groups immigrated to the United States, or the American continent, rather. But as we've noticed in this lesson, though, every one of them originated in Europe. You could even say the Methodists originated in Europe because they came out of the Church of England. And when they came over here, they were still Church of England. They just changed their structure and some of their beliefs post-Revolutionary War. But our next lesson, we're really going to start diving deep into the American denominationalism. Lord willing, next week we'll be starting on Methodism and the three major groups of Methodism. See if I can remember these because they're confusing. The African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, AMES, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and the United Methodist, which has recently gone through a major split over homosexuality. And we'll get into that some too. But those are the three major ones we'll discuss in some of the history of it in the next. We'll start, Lord willing, next week, and then that's going to take more than 1 week to go through. So, questions or comments on this lesson? All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the comments through class, and we'll stop early today. Thank you.